uploads. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to another day of True Crime at Christmas. Are you staying warm? It's getting colder and colder out there. Here's your reminder to subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and set your post notifications to all so you know exactly when your mum uploads. I'm uploading every single day in December up until Christmas Day, exclusively true crime content. Today we are going to discuss a few cases of a very sad phenomenon when supposedly young, innocent children turn into killers. I'll talk a little bit about how I came upon these cases. Basically, there is a page on Wikipedia, the pinnacle of research, which lists the youngest killers known in the world, starting from an unnamed 4-year-old boy in Saudi Arabia, who we know nothing about the crime, nothing about his circumstances because he's 4 years old. The criminal age in most places is obviously way higher than that for the age of criminal responsibility, so he is essentially protected, all the way up to 17-year-old killers. First of all, I zoned in on a case where the perpetrator had also taken their own life, and I was convinced this would have been like a 15, 16-year-old kid, but no. Today we are first discussing the Sparks middle school shooter, Jose Reyes. He was just 12 years old when he opened fire in the basketball court of his middle school on October the 12th, 2013. Jose Horatio Reyes was born in Reno, Nevada in the summer of 2001 to Mexican parents, who would then go on to have more children to make them a family of 5. It does appear that there was some dysfunction in the household growing up for Jose. His father was charged and pled guilty to child abuse. He pled guilty to misdemeanor child abuse involving his son Jose. Also, in his younger years, Jose had written suicide notes and taken stolen medication on 2 separate occasions, all leading up to the events of October the 12th. Jose opened fire using a semi-automatic handgun. He injured 2 other students. KJ Kersey was shot in the shoulder, and Mason Davies was shot in the abdomen. Mason was shot when coming to the aid of 45-year-old teacher Michael Lansbury, who was unfortunately shot and killed during that morning. Jose Reyes then turned the gun on himself, ending his life in front of his horrified peers and teachers. This case is beyond horrific. What kind of tragic events have to happen to a 12-year-old to not only attempt suicide twice, then culminating to the fact that he felt there was no other way to express and deal with what he was going through than to open fire on his school? Michael Lansbury, the teacher who was killed in this tragic shooting, was trying to intervene and stop kids getting hurt. There isn't much data on Jose Reyes regarding before this attack, whether he was receiving any help, whether his parents were taking his suicidal ideation seriously and getting him treatment. Clearly, he wasn't. This made me incredibly sad to read about, and it also reminded me a lot of the Brenda Spencer case. She was a 16-year-old girl who opened fire at the elementary school across from her house, and that's the I Don't Like Mondays case. But that was shocking enough for a 16-year-old girl, and this was a 12-year-old boy, barely getting to grips with his emotions, and suddenly he just has so many hardships and so much abuse to deal with. He broke like this at just 12 years old. This case was actually discussed quite extensively in the media by Hillary Clinton during her presidential campaign. She would use it as a case study to vie for better gun control legislation, and I massively agree with that standpoint. I'm sorry for any American viewers of mine that just wholeheartedly support their own right to bear arms. I just don't agree. I don't agree with that mentality whatsoever. On to another case of kids who kill. We are going to delve into Ireland's youngest convicted murderers, who we know nothing about. Anna Kriegel was brutally murdered on May the 14th, 2018 in Fingal, Ireland. She was of Russian-Irish descent and was just 14 years old at the time she was murdered by 2 13-year-old boys. Anna was last seen alive that day at about 5:30 in St. Catherine's Park. She had gone out after she had been called upon at her home by a boy later identified to be Boy B in this case. Anna's mother said she found that incredibly strange, as she noted that Anna didn't have any friends and no one would call on Anna. Her body was discovered 3 days later on the 17th of May in a derelict farmhouse west of Lucan. Her clothes were scattered around the house, and her death was determined as being caused by blunt force trauma due to some bloodied pieces of wood that they found inside this farmhouse. There were also extensive extensive signs of sexual assault on the body. The two boys, hereafter known as Boy A and Boy B, were immediately under suspicion, and they were both eventually charged with Anna's murder and additionally with aggravated sexual assault. They were found guilty of Anna's murder in July of 2019. And after this conviction, despite there being a court order that these boys would never be identified, they were to be protected in the media, there were apparently a number of social media posts made on Twitter and Facebook identifying these child murderers. Of course, the platforms were served with injunctions and the posts were quickly removed. I didn't research and I didn't look for these posts because these boys are not allowed to be named for legal reasons, and we're going to keep it that way. The sentencing took place in November of last year. Boy A was sentenced to life with a review period after 12 years. Additionally, he was sentenced to 12 years for aggravated sexual assault, but these sentences run concurrently, not consecutively, so effectively he only received 12 years. Boy B was sentenced to 15 years with a review period after 8. Clearly, we don't know the details here, but it seems Boy A was a lot more involved in the attack. As Boy B doesn't have that additional charge for the aggravated sexual assault, we can assume that that was performed by Boy A. The boys are currently interred in Obertown Detention Centre in North Dublin and will be transferred to adult prison at the age of 18, which is in about 3 years for them. I'm unsure of their exact ages. It's noted in this article that Boy A was assaulted in prison in May of this year. He received minor injuries, and who really cares? Anna was said to be a great source of strength for her family and a dream come true for them. Denise Fergus commented on the fact that she was concerned about how these boys weren't named in the media. If you don't know who Denise Fergus is, she was Denise Bolger at the time, and she is the mother of 2-year-old James Bolger, who was tragically murdered by 2 10-year-old boys back in the 90s. But those boys were publicly named and heavily publicized in the media. We all know their faces, we all know their names. And to be honest, I'm unsure of how these decisions are made. It's clear that the 90s were a different time, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, though, that 10-year-old boys were named, being even younger, and they get named, they get pictured, but 13-year-old boys, they get protected. I'm in two minds, to be honest, on how I feel about the situation as a whole. I don't know where the logic is behind putting an age limit on publicly naming and picturing kids who do these kind of crimes. But this might be an unpopular opinion, but just hear me out. I don't think that the boys in the James Bolger case should have been named and pictured if they were just going to be protected into their adulthood. I had never heard of the Anna Kriegel case, and I had never heard of the events surrounding that case and the 13-year-old boys, and I think that is because they were not heavily media publicised. When the James Bolger case happened and the 2 boys were publicly outed, it was the shock of looking upon the faces of these boys who were children, so obviously young and so obviously shocking that they could be the ones to do this. And that's what brought the media craze surrounding that murder and surrounding those 2 boys. And if you hadn't pictured them and you hadn't named them publicly, they were always going to be released and they were always going to have a new life sorted out for them after their release from prison. Because when you try people as children, generally their sentences don't go much into their adult life because they are given an opportunity to be rehabilitated and reformed. So when you outed Robert Thompson and John Venables, it always led their life back to that moment. And either you decide that they're not going to be released and they're not going to be allowed back into the public, whereas naming them wouldn't have caused as much of an issue, but because they were released at the ages of 20, they were 20, 21 when they were released, and they had new lives sorted for them, and they had brand new identities and new lives to put this old horrific event that they had committed behind them. But we all knew what they looked like, we all knew their names. It seems that one of them kind of has kept the low profile since its release. The other one has been in and out of prison again. He has revealed his identity to members in his circle, and none of that would have happened if you hadn't have outed them at 10 years old. And I don't think people realize how much money it costs to give people new identities, because there needs to be new passports, you need to move them to a whole different area, you need to set them up to succeed in life. And if we didn't know their names and we didn't know what they looked like and we hadn't had the media frenzy surrounding the case, we wouldn't have wasted as much money as we wouldn't have wasted all of the money that we did on John Venables having to give him a new identity all the fucking time. I'm just confused as to why they would publicly print their names and faces when they're just going to attempt to protect their identities later on. It wasn't up for debate that the boys would be released as adults. It wasn't up for debate that these boys were going to prison for the rest of their lives, lock them up, throw away the key. That was never going to happen. They're 10 years old. So I don't know. I don't think the Bulger case was handled particularly well. I'm not saying anything about what happened to James Bulger, because that's clearly not the thing up for debate here. What's up for debate is how they handled the aftermath. Lastly, we are going to discuss a case of a child serial killer. This was a boy named Craig Price, who committed his crimes in Warwick, Rhode Island, between the ages of 13 and 15 years old. This was between July of 87 and September of 89. His first murder, which he committed at just 13 years old, started when he broke into a home just 2 doors down from his own, where he took a knife from the kitchen and stabbed 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer over 50 times. Craig wouldn't murder again until 2 years later, when he was a freshman in high school, and he murdered 3 of his neighbours on the 1st of September 1989. He was high on LSD and marijuana. He stabbed 39-year-old Joan Heaton 57 times, her 10-year-old daughter Jennifer 62 times. Then he crushed the skull of Joan's other daughter, Melissa, before stabbing her 30 times. These stabbings were so brutal that the handles of the knives snapped off and the blades were left inside the bodies of the victims. Craig Price's records were sealed at the time of this offence, so the violence of these crimes were largely unknown to the public. He apparently had zero remorse when he was confessing, and stated that these killings were fueled by racial attacks that he had received by white people growing up, citing the first time he ever wanted to kill anyone as an event when he was called a bunch of racial slurs by a group of adult white people who then tried to run him over with a car. And that was way before his first murder, so he would have been way under the age of 13 when these people were hurling racial abuse at him. He has apparently been convicted of a lot of further violence since his incarceration, for things like fighting. He apparently stabbed a guard with a homemade shank. He's also been transferred a lot to other prisons due to his violent tendencies. He was also accused of stabbing a fellow inmate in 2017, and for that additional crime, he's been sentenced to a further 25 years. He's been denied parole ever since 2009, and back then his release date was set for May 2020. Like, we've denied you parole, it's going to be another 11 years before you're going to get out, but your parole date is May 2020. But because of the further violent crimes he's committed, that date's just into oblivion, like 2120 probably, dude. Thank you for diving into this topic with me today. I think I'll definitely do a part 2. There were so many cases that I was reading about during the research for this. I've got a whole other video scripted, so stay tuned for part 2. A lot of these cases aren't widely discussed because of the fact that kids aren't really outed anymore for the violent crimes that they commit, and I think that's a smart move. If you're going to reintegrate them into society and you're going to give them another chance to be rehabilitated, it's best that the public don't know who they are. Thank you for joining me for another day of True Crime at Christmas. I will see you tomorrow, same time, same place. Don't be late. Please like the video if you made it this far, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. But that's it from me today, kids, and I'll be back.